Hello and welcome to the Deb Calvert channel here on Bright Talk. Thank you very much for joining me again this month for another presentation in our series of Sales Manager Essentials. Whether you are participating in the certificate program and attending all 12 of these webinars in sequence or not, I'm really glad you're here because each one of these can stand alone. Today's a little more interactive than some, so I'm really looking for the live audience to help us out with some input. Be ready. I'll be asking you to give me some feedback and some opinions along the way. Today's program is aimed at helping you to make the very best possible hiring decisions. I'm going to share with you some pieces of the systems that a lot of the big Fortune 500 use. I've put them together in a way that it looks like it's all one intact system, but I want to make sure to point out to you that you'll be able to take bits and pieces and enhance your own hiring system or create one from scratch. The idea here is to be able to see examples of all the components so that you can put together the component pieces that make sense for you. And if you need any help with that, just let me know. I put my email address for you in the presenter to audience announcements because I want to be able to help you make something out of this that's not just conceptual. Everything we're talking about today is based on the premise that people can fake their way through an interview, especially salespeople, that they can fake their way through an interview, but they can't fake their way through life. So you, as the interviewer, have to tap into their real life to truly assess your candidates and how they fit your needs. This is, by the way, a continuation of last month's presentation about sales competencies. I'll review a little bit of that so that you've got context in case you missed last month. I also gave you a link in the attachments and links if you want to go a little bit deeper into that topic. For those who are new to Bright Talk, I mentioned attachments and links. That's an important piece of this. We try to load it up with some extra value and some bonus content for you. If you're someone who likes to take notes along the way, the first attachment that you'll see is a PDF of the slides I'm about to present to you. So feel free to download that and print that out so you can take notes. I also would like to encourage you to take a look at the second attachment. That's how you and I can get connected on LinkedIn if we aren't already. I'd really like to be able to continue the conversation over there. Something else to point out for those of you who are new to Bright Talk, the lower right-hand corner, you see a button there that says Get Live Support Now, and that's the place to go. If you experience any technical difficulties during this presentation, please go directly to the Bright Talk Get Live Support via chat. They're going to do a much better job for you than I'll be able to in the middle of the presentation. I will be asking for you to give me some feedback during this presentation. You'll post that in the place where it says questions. So, of course, post your questions there if you have them along the way. But a couple of times today I'm going to ask you for some direct feedback so that we have some items that we can respond to for those who are listening live. And if you're coming in later, as so many of you do, to come back and listen on demand, I'm sorry that we don't get a chance for you to directly participate like that. But I'd still like to. That's why you have my email address and how to connect with me on LinkedIn. Well, I'm Deb Calvert. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing myself. Suffice it to say that I've been working my entire career, and it's a long one, in sales as a sales coach, directly with sales executives and managers, helping to improve hiring practices and increase the effectiveness overall of the sales organization. We've got a lot of ground to cover today. This is going to be a system for your consideration, but remember what I said, this is all the pieces. You're going to select out and modify the ones that make sense for your organization. I'm covering all of this to show you the best case examples, but it's certainly not the only way. I'm pretty confident that you'll see one or two things that you haven't seen before, ways that you can enhance your hiring and, as a result, improve the caliber of the people that you're selecting into your organization. It all starts by knowing exactly what you're looking for in a candidate. You are going to have a lot of hit and miss hiring if you're focusing on gut instinct or on the resume and the reported experience alone. What you really want, if we break it down into the piece parts, you want candidates who know certain things. They have knowledge walking in the door. And it's going to impact their success if they know those things. So what is it that they need to know before they walk in the door? And what do they need to be able to do? What skills do they already have? When you hire them, they come equipped with those skills, and those are the important skills. You've identified them ahead of time, the critical skills for being effective in this role. Last but not least, you also want candidates, you want to pick the candidates who have certain characteristics, certain traits. What are those traits? What are the ones in your organization for that particular role that you're going to fill? What traits make someone successful? Now, what I'm referring to, knowledge, skills, and traits, these are competencies. And as I said, I did a whole webinar on sales competencies last month. I gave you a link so you can go back and pick that one up if you need to. But for what we're working on here today, you just need to have the concept of competencies. You need to understand that they have the three pieces, the knowledge, the skills, and the traits. And you're going to be defining those on the front end. This isn't something you do after you've interviewed everybody. Before you even post the job, you should decide in this role, what do people need to know? What do they need to be able to do? And what are the traits that they should have that will make them successful? And if you're wondering, well, how do I know that? The first thing to do is look at people who are most successful. Top performers. They are knowing certain things, doing certain things, and embody characteristics that cause them to be more effective. You don't want to pick these out of a hat. It shouldn't be arbitrary. It shouldn't be things that you think are just sort of have. These should be the proven competencies that make someone truly effective. Another resource you might consider would be anything that you can get your hands on that's current for sales trends. And what I mean by that is, what is it that buyers want? What are they responding to? What are their expectations from the sellers they choose to do business with? That's exactly what we explored in our research for the book, Stop Selling and Start Leading. So I gave you a link to that one too. Now you're looking for your ideal. So you set up your competencies. You know before you ever start exactly what your ideal, your perfect candidate is going to bring into the organization. Now I got a little news for you. No surprise, right? You're never going to find that ideal, perfect candidate. But what you will be doing now is using an appropriate benchmark. Right? That ideal, that's what you're measuring against. Instead of it being gut feel or something else that is subjective, you now have an objective list of what knowledge, what skills, and what traits would make someone successful. And you're going to measure all of your candidates for that role against the exact same set of competencies. That makes it fair. That's your ideal. That's what you're collectively aiming for in the sales reps that you hire into any one job at any one time. It won't be the same for every sales job. In fact, it might be different by territory or category. But in one instance, one job that's posted for that particular job, all the candidates get measured by the same yardstick. So you pick those particular knowledge sets, skill sets, traits for that job at this time. That's what you're measuring against. Now, having done that, you're going to end up with a better barometer of what someone is going to need to be successful. You're going to have a better yardstick for measuring people against, and you're going to rely on that objective criteria that you've set instead of your gut. And I know for some of you that's a real blow, that's a shocker, because you want to hire people who you have that feeling about. The problem with that feeling is that it's not objective, and people can fool you. And you run the risk of showing favoritism or unconscious bias. It's not defensible, should you ever be challenged, to say, well, I had a good feeling about that person. It's human nature for us to gravitate to the people who are most like us. So be very careful and don't over-rely on something so subjective. Now, let's take a step back. Why does it matter? Why does all of this work, doing what I've just described as a little extra work, why is this important to do? Well, it's important because you need strong salespeople, the ones who are the most likely to be successful. And you need to not only hire them, but also hire the ones who are most likely to be successful so they stay with your organization. Because as you probably know, a turnover in a sales team is very, very costly. On average, studies tell us that it costs about 250% of their total compensation for a territory to be vacant. But that doesn't even factor in all the hidden costs, like what's happening to other members of the sales team who try to cover, the ones who are hearing complaints from customers, who are taking on extra work, who are making mistakes, whose morale is compromised. And by the way, what's the impact on you, the sales manager? As you're sitting in interviews and trying to do all that territory coverage yourself, it means that you're not keeping up with your own work. You're not developing and giving time to the salespeople who are sticking around, and it can become a very vicious downward spiral. It can really zap a sales organization, and I've seen this happen time and time again, but it's preventable with better hiring practices, bringing in the right people, making sure that you make smart selections. You don't have to deal with any of that. Okay, so back to our perfect or our ideal candidate. Objectively, it's going to be the one who's the closest match to those competencies that you pre-selected. And you're going to favor the traits, because think about it. You want people to bring in certain knowledge, but you can teach them things that they don't know. And you want them to have certain skills, but you can develop skills in someone. What you can't change, the thing that would be the most difficult to change, would be the characteristics. Do you want someone who's resilient? Well, if you don't hire someone who's resilient, you're going to have a really hard time building up resilience in a person. Same is true for being self-motivated or having an optimistic outlook or being someone who is tenacious and just never gives up. Whatever the traits are that are most important to you, you're going to want to weight those just a little more heavily than any skills or knowledge that you're willing and able to give to somebody after you hire them. Being objective means that you're not going to be choosing based on your gut feel, and that's an important thing because now your process will be more fair, legal, and open a positive applicant experience, which means that you'll have more likelihood of the marketplace responding in kind. As people talk favorably about your hiring process, you might get a few more quality candidates. Here's why we're looking to replace the old ways that you've done things before I introduce the new way. And I bet you're here because you've experienced something like this. Traditional interviewing practices sometimes fail. Maybe you've hired someone who absolutely seemed like a total superstar. They came through looking like a 10 in your interview process. Maybe even in the first few weeks on the job, they looked like they had it all, but then something didn't work out. You've got to go back and sort of analyze this. What possible clues did you miss in the hiring process? It's easy to fool an interviewer, especially one who's desperate to fill a sales territory and has been taxed with a lot of turnover and is just looking for some hero to ride in on a white horse and take that sales job. We put ourselves sometimes in a situation where we're fooled. And traditional practices also, they can fail because our gut's not good enough, because we have stereotypes about what it takes to be successful as a seller, because we tend to favor people who are more like us if we see ourselves in them a little bit. We might this a little too narrowly on what's on the resume. If they've got all this experience and they come directly from our own industry, it looks like that ought to be a perfect fit. But there's more. There are those intangibles that the resume will never reveal. We've got to be sure that we're doing something differently and that we give people, everybody who comes through the interview, the same chance. That's hard because we do interview people at different times, maybe even in different places. We're in different moods. We're probably asking different questions. We have different pressures in any given moment. So we might not be giving people the same chance, just inadvertently. And because we didn't give them the same chance, maybe the candidate isn't the best one. It was just that we were our best selves when we interviewed that person. If we're better in the interview and it's not the candidate who was better, well, that's unfortunate because that's not going to be sustainable. So all these reasons, and you can probably add a few of your own, we need to do things a little differently. Now what I'm going to do is show you a process, and I'm going to walk you through the steps of the process. As I said before, this is an example. It is not the example, but it's a pretty good one. It is used by a lot of the Fortune 500 companies. What you see here in lighter blue color, those are steps that your HR partners could play for you to help save some time. And what you see in dark blue, that would be the role of the hiring manager, the sales manager, plus a few others who can help you out. Now, you'll decide how long this should take from beginning to end, but think about this from the candidate's perspective. From the time they apply for the job to the time they get that offer letter, how much patience do they have? How many other opportunities will they get? Why should they wait around for you to go through a lengthy, drawn-out process? At the same time, if it's too fast and it looks like a desperation move, how does that cause the candidate to think of you? So in your market, in your industry, you have to decide what the timeline looks like. But do give that some thought and try to stick within it so you can convey that and you can set those expectations for your candidates. What you're looking to do is get the best fit candidate. We'll come back to where that fits in just a moment. The best fit candidate so that you increase retention, you decrease turnover. By decreasing turnover, you do a better job with customer satisfaction and with getting your top line revenue, as well as cutting your expenses, at least related to hiring. So profitability goes up too. Not only that, but keep in mind that your interviewing and your hiring practices, they influence public perception. You want to be an employer of choice. You want people in the marketplace to talk favorably about the way that you hire and the people you hire. And you also want there to be a strong internal perception. You want people who you hire to feel like they've run the gauntlet and it's really special. They made it all the way through. And they happen to be the one that you chose. So let's take these step by step. The first step is the pre-screening. And maybe this hasn't worked for you in the past because I'm suggesting that your human resources department do this. But I talk to a lot of sales organizations, a lot of sales managers who have stopped relying on HR because in the past their HR partners didn't do a very good job for them. And usually when I investigate that, it's because the HR partners weren't really sure what matters. They didn't have a template to screen against. They didn't have any insights about what it was you wanted them to be screening for as opposed to resume experience, which was easy to fool somebody with. So we want HR to be ascertaining just a couple of things, 3 things actually. We want them to be looking at how does this person fit with the values and the culture in your organization. And you want them to check these other 2 criteria, which I put on a grid for you. How motivated is this person to sell? And how able are they to sell? We want to know about ability and motivation. When you look at this little graphic, the A stands for able. So the top 2 boxes are people who are able to sell, and they demonstrate that in their pre-screen. The I's stand for an inability to sell. They're lacking something. And then the second letters stand for motivated. So on the right-hand side, you have M's for motivated. On the left-hand side, the U's stand for unmotivated to sell. Obviously, you want your HR folks to pre-screen and send through the candidates to you in the upper right-hand box. They are both able to sell and motivated to sell. You do not want any of the IUs. They have an inability to sell and they're unmotivated to sell. And if you really need some additional candidates, I'm going to suggest that you favor the ones who are motivated but currently have an inability. So long as it's teachable, if they've got the right characteristics and the motivation, and if you have the time and the ability to train them, I would say you go there as opposed to the upper left box where they've got the ability, but they're not all that motivated. And believe me, we all hire way too many of these folks. They've got it on paper, but when it comes right down to it, because they're unmotivated, they disappoint us every time. And then it's difficult to move them out. So you end up stuck with people who aren't doing the job. So favor the upper right-hand box. If you have to have a second choice, go for the lower right-hand box. I think you'll find that that one gets you further. Okay, so HR is doing this pre-screening, and you're going to give them the questions to ask. You're going to tell them how to find out whether or not this person is able to sell, motivated to sell, and a good fit with your values in your organization. Here are some questions. And what you need with HR, in addition to these questions, are the examples. If I'm asking this question, what should I be listening for? What should I be listening for that causes me to do a little plus sign? Yes, this person answered favorably, or a minus sign. No person answered in ways that are not acceptable for us. Well, let's know what they might hear from candidates in response to these questions. And ask them to take some notes. If they're unsure especially, take some notes so that they can give it back to you and you can decide if it represents ability or not, motivation or not, organizational fit or not. Here's an example. Let's say on paper that you noticed on their resume that they have won some sales awards. Okay, that looks like a pretty positive indicator. Based on that alone, you might want to bring them in for an interview. But you know what else you need to know before you leap to that conclusion? You need to know how recent sales awards were, and you need to hear some pride in the accomplishment. You need for HR to screen to find out how that person is talking about their own award. They're either going to talk about it in a way that's oblique, oh yeah, the team, and they're kind of vague about it, and it starts to sound like it's not actually something they did themselves at all. Or they're going to talk about it, because this is a salesperson, they're going to talk about exactly what they did to win the award, exactly what they continue to do because they're proud of that award, and what's replicatable in the organization. It's not just situational or luck of draw. It's the individual who earned that award. So you help HR understand what they're screening for. And after they've screened and found you the candidates who are able and motivated and a good fit, then it's time for those candidates to fill out an application. You know, there are legal reasons in most U.S. states to have an application before the actual interviewing begins. Employment law has really gotten quite complex, and you always want to protect the company and yourself from accidentally offending anyone. And then there are EEOC complaints that they can trigger investigations or legal discovery, which would require that documentation. So before you ever bring them in for the interview, it's a good idea to have HR facilitate them filling out an application. And then, of course, keep that application. Keep it for at least 2 years. Keep the information that you copy down in the interview. Keep that too. And make sure that if there's any information on the application that's different from what you see on the resume, either because you asked for it or because there's a contradiction between the two, be sure that HR is looking for that and figuring out what's going on there. Okay, now the process comes to you. You're still not going to bring them in. Your time is too valuable. There's a little bit more you can do to save yourself some time. Now, you got these examples, good and bad, that HR heard during the pre-screen. And you're going to be probing into that just a little bit. You want to confirm for yourself that HR's assessment is accurate. Here's the place where you check the resume. Tell me a little bit more about the time you XYZ and why did you leave company B to go to company C. Right? Find out the things you need to know to be sure this is somebody that you want to carve out time face-to-face with. If it is, go ahead and do it. Set the appointment and set the expectations. Whatever your interviews typically look like, convey that to the candidate. We'd like to invite you in for a 90-minute interview. While you're here, you're going to meet with me, the hiring manager, and another sales manager as well. We're going to take you through an interview, and in some cases, we ask people to later conduct a role play with us. Whatever your process looks like, be transparent, tell them about it up front. Because you set up a time frame and thought about that earlier, make sure your appointments are in alignment with that. Don't set an appointment 2 weeks from now if your whole process is only going to take 2 weeks. So try to gauge also the urgency. How willing is this candidate to make time for you? Set up the appointment and then be ready for the interview. Now here's where things are going to get different from what you've done in the past. I want to make sure we leave plenty of time to talk about this interview. I do see your questions that you're posting. Thank you for doing that. Keep them coming. I'm going to try to answer them as we go. Your interview is going to be a very, very specific process. I'm going to cover a lot of ground here. You're going to conduct this interview with a partner. And whoever your partner is for this particular job to be filled, that should be your partner on every single interview to fill this job. So you and one other peer manager, a sales manager, ideally, you're going to conduct all of the interviews for this particular job. You're going to do these in a way that is pretty much the same, one interview to the next. Because you did this pre-screening and this phone screening, you won't have to do as many of the face-to-face interviews as perhaps you've done in the past. So I'm recommending that you bring in, depending on the job, 5 or 6 candidates. You're not going to ask the traditional types of questions. You already did that in the phone screen. And you already counted on HR to cover some of that ground too. Instead, you're going to conduct what's called a behavioral interview. This is based on that premise I described earlier, which is that you can fool an interviewer, but you can't fool somebody when you're talking about all different aspects of your life. So it's no longer, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Tell me about your success in your current job. These are going to be very different types of questions. And throughout the interview, until the very end, you're not going to open the floor to the candidates for them to ask questions. You have a very deliberate reason for going through behavioral interview question sets, which are based on the competencies that you defined at the beginning. So you've got maybe as many as 10 competencies, skills, knowledge, and traits. And for each of those, you have 3 questions, behavioral interviewing questions. They come in sets. You've got your partner who's conducting these interviews with you, and each of you has a question set that you are going to ask about every time. Behavioral interviewing relies on the fact that the best indicator of future behaviors are someone's past behaviors. You want to know how someone is going to perform when it comes to any one of the competencies that you've selected. Well, then you ask them about situations in the past. You ask them for concrete, specific, real stories about situations they've experienced in the past, and then you drill down to ask their own behaviors. In that situation, what did you do? And then you ask them to connect the dots. When you did that in that situation, what was the outcome? So these are called SBR, situation, behavior, results, question sets. I have interview guides for virtually any competency that you can imagine. So if you need some help getting started and you'd rather not do this work on your own, let's be in touch. But it sort of works like this. You don't tell them the competency. You're not telling them or flagging for them, okay, now I want to talk about prospecting or account maximization or any other one that you've selected. You just ask a set of questions. And you'll have to coach them just a little bit at the beginning because this is different from what they've experienced. You're going to say something like, tell me about a time when you had to grow revenue from established accounts. And one of three things is going to happen. They're either going to say, oh, well, I've only done new business development. I've never grown revenue from established accounts. And now you know. If you have your ideal candidate profile, including this type of experience, you now know that this person doesn't fit here. They're going to get a lower mark on the matrix that you're using to evaluate them. Or, second choice, they're going to start telling you a story, an actual true story about a time when they were able to grow revenue from established accounts, in which case you're probably going to rate them favorably if it is their own behaviors and they do see that they got favorable results from that. The third option, and this happens early in the interview much more than it happens later in the interview, what will happen is they start talking to you in hypotheticals. They'll say things like, well, if I ever had that situation, I'd probably, or, yeah, I think what I'd like to do in that situation. And so you have to listen. You have to hear those flag words that tell you this isn't a real situation that we're talking about. So you push pause. You say, okay, hang on. Thank you for that. What I'm looking for are concrete, specific stories about what you have actually done. So take your time, think about it, and let me know about a specific example. And after you do that once, maybe twice, they start to fall right in line, and you're going to hear the specifics and the stories. By the time the interview's over, you won't even have to ask all three questions because they'll know what's coming. They'll tell you the situation, their own behaviors, and their results. Anytime that you are asking them about their own behaviors, be sure that you listen for a second set of flags. Because if they say, my manager always, or other members of my team, or they use the word we, you've got to probe that to find out for this person, the one that you might hire, what is it that they did? If they didn't do it, they can't replicate it and bring it to you. And if they don't know the results, if they can't tell you the story all the way through to connect the dots and say how their actions produce favorable results, well, let that be a flag to you as well. That might mean that you're rating them a 4 instead of a 5, because if they don't know how they produce the results, they might not be able to do that for you either. Okay, so you're walking through, you're doing this entire process. If you want more information about behavioral interviewing, I gave you a link to a blog post that's going to go into more detail than we have time to today, but I wanted to introduce the concept. This is powerful. It really works. It's a game changer in terms of selection. So behavioral interviewing is something that you really ought to look into. Now, next in the process, because we're only at the first 5, next in the process, some of you this will be for your candidates who score highly on the behavioral interview. Feel free to let candidates go before making the role play if you know they just aren't they don't have what they need to be successful in this role. When you do the role play, it too should be just exactly the same for every candidate who comes into this phase of your process. You should have different competencies that you're looking for in the role play. Some of them are easy to measure in an interview. Others are easier to measure in a role play. For example, if you want people to conduct really good needs analysis, it's important that they are able to do a strong discovery. That one is a lot easier to measure in a role play. So is closing the sale. So you might think about constructing a role play where those types of competencies are the ones that are being demonstrated. So you conduct a role play. You're giving them an exercise that is exactly the same for every candidate. You can do this in person right after the interview. You can set a separate appointment for it, or you can have this be something they do over the phone with you, especially if the salespeople you're going to be hiring do a lot of their work over the phone. Well, wouldn't you like to see how the candidate shows up on the phone? So you'll decide, make sure that you are constructing the role play so that it represents behaviors that you need to see, including traits that you like your best candidates to demonstrate to you. You might also think about how the role play is going to factor in. How significantly are you going to weight that as you assess your candidates? Now, you've heard me talk about weighting the competencies, and you've heard me talk about grading the candidates. You're going to do all of that in a matrix. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But I do want to point out that you and your partner are not going to compare notes. You won't, at the end of an interview, say, hey, what'd you think of that candidate? You won't talk about it because you don't want to influence each other's assessment and grading of candidates going forward. That's inherently unfair to the candidate who was the first one in the door. So you withhold all of that discussion until all of the interviews and all of the role play are done. You fill out your matrix, each of you, then you have your discussion, you compare your scores, and your top couple, 2, maybe 3 candidates, are going to come into a final interview. And in that final interview, I suggest that it be you and your boss. You tell the candidate or the finalist, you bring them in for a second interview. You won't do as much talking. It should be a pretty short interview. But what you've decided in advance with your manager is that there's going to be one area that you need to probe, one area that is the biggest concern for you, and you're going to pose that to the candidate as an objection. You might say something, in fact, your boss, your sales director might say something like, you know, in this job, there's a heavy amount of prospecting that's required, and it didn't look to us in the initial interviews like that was an area of strength for you. You pose it as an objection because, frankly, you need to know if the people you hire into sales roles can handle objections. Wouldn't you like to see how they're going to do with that? So you give them an objection. And at the end of this interview, you give them an opportunity to close the sale. Of course, you don't call it that, but you say something that invites them to close the sale. Something like, well, I think that's all we have for you. Anything else you want us to know? Because you want them to try and close the sale. You want the candidates who are most interested, most motivated, and most able to make a strong closing argument for themselves. The final interview is something that is also scored independently. You and the sales director, the two of you, independently rate the candidates who come through. You've got matrix items for them here as well. And it should be, at the end of it all, it should be the highest cumulative score. When you tally everything up all together, that score should be the determining factor about who you hire. Because you had your ideal, you set benchmarks, you created an objective process, you decided what success looks like, you decided what the items would be that would take away from the score. All of this was laid out beforehand. And we have all this for you. If you want to pursue something like this, give me a call. We'll talk about it, and we'll equip you with a sales selection guide that includes these matrices, it includes competencies, it includes processes, whatever you want, customized for you so that you get the very best fit candidates into your organization. But you make it an objective process. In your selection matrix, you're ranking candidates independently, each interviewer. You're compiling scores at the end. You're validating those rankings because you had behavioral examples that you were looking for, and you have notes that you took to help see who was the best fit. And all of this becomes a record of your process in case you would ever be challenged. You might be thinking right about now, what happens if my favorite, the one I liked the best, didn't rank the highest? Well, that is a tricky question, but you're still going to go with the one who scored the highest, not your favorite, not your gut instinct, not the one who you might have hired otherwise. Keep that person in mind. Maybe you're going to have another job that opens up and you'd bring them back for another interview. But take a look at what it is that caused them not to be rated the highest and tell them. Tell them you were a front runner. Somebody else was able to come through a little closer to our ideal, objectively speaking. Next time we're hiring, I'd like to bring you back in. In the meantime, here's what I would need you to work on. And when they come back in, you take them through the same gauntlet. It's the same process. This time, hopefully, they'll be able to tell you a story of what they've done to work on the area where they were deficient. From a legal perspective, this is a solid process. And from a performance and a productivity standpoint, this is going to give you the candidates who ramp up the fastest and who are able to do the best job for you. When it's all said and done, it goes back to human resources. Right? They're going to be the ones who communicate to the candidate. They check the references. They clear any of that employment history stuff up. They do the offer letter. Right? They help to onboard the candidate. So HR is helping you on the back end just like they did on the front end. And you don't have to worry about some of those things like the drug screens and the background checks and the offer letters. Now, before you take any of this live, I would strongly recommend in your organization that you also do some skills practice. What I'm describing to you, I've crammed a lot into just 45 minutes. What I'm describing to you really works, but it works better when you've had some practice. So don't be afraid to do a little practice internally, and you might use a step-by-step process that I've described on screen with this slide to make that happen. Okay, now I suspect you have some questions for me. I didn't do some of the things that I said I was going to do along the way because I was watching the clock, so I'll tell you what they are now. What I would have liked to have done, if time had allowed, is I would have liked for you to post what you need when it comes to specific types of knowledge and what you need in your ideal candidate when it comes to the very specific skills that make one candidate more likely to be successful than another in the actual job. And I would have asked you, what traits would you like to see in your ideal candidate? The traits that your most successful sellers embody. So you'll start there. You'll make those lists, and then you'll take the steps. You'll construct the process like the 9 steps I showed you, but you'll make your own ideas about what that process should look like. You'll involve HR, you'll have some conversations back and forth, and before you'll know it, you'll have a rock-solid process, the one that's going to produce for you candidates that are more likely to be successful. I gave you some attachments. I'll link back to the webinar that's all about competencies if you need to catch up with that. A link to a post that's all about how to hire a rock star sales team, so it takes you through behavioral interviewing in more detail. I've given you a way to get connected with me on LinkedIn. You've got my email address. You're going to stay in touch with me so that you have some real help on making this practical and actionable, not just theoretical, not just a concept. And with that, I think I've answered all the questions that have been posted. We have about half a minute left. If you have any additional questions that you want to ask me before our time is up, do it now. And of course, it's an open invitation. If you can't do it right now, then be in touch with me and we'll do it as the timing makes sense for you. For those who are listening on demand, this is an open invitation, not just for all the people who are listening live, but take those attachments, get what you need, and be in touch with me. Hey, thanks for attending this webinar. Thanks for sticking with me through a very fast, high-level overview of the ways that you can make your hiring process more effective so you're selecting the sales candidates who are going to be more successful.